and very briefly give an introduction to Kerry-Ann Charles. Very, very excited to have her here with us. Kerry-Ann is a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. She's always happy to say a proud mom of 2 boys, and she's been a team member for Cambium Indigenous Professional Services since 2017 as their environmental partnership coordinator. She has served her community for over 17 years in many capacities, and most recently for the last 10 as their environmental coordinator. Through that role, she has led the partnership with the Climate Risk Institute in developing the Georgina Island First Nation Climate Change Adaptation Planning Framework, which uses traditional ecological knowledge as the foundation for climate change planning. Stemming from that work, she's worked within her community, as well as with a number of other communities, in developing climate change adaptation and implementation plans, continuing to do so in her position with the Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. And finally, Kerry-Ann has gained extensive international recognition, being asked to speak across Canada, throughout the US and in Mexico in the area of Indigenous partnerships and environmental initiatives. And most recently, she was asked to speak at the COP27 conference as the Indigenous lead for the Commission of Environmental Cooperation. So with that, I welcome Kerry-Ann to the stage and very much look forward to your presentation today. Thank you, Kerry-Ann.
So I'm not tech savvy and I do need notes. And so we had to sort of jimmy some stuff up here. So I'm going to have to click twice. So please bear with me as I work through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization first, because I think it's something, again, Linda had talked about transformational change. And I think this is something that we're really proud of and can help in doing that transformational change. And so CIPS is Indigenous owned, operated, and uniquely all Indigenous staffed environmental consulting organization. My boss is from Curve Lake. He is the owner and is not a traditional guy. So he actually opened the organization based on circumstance. He's a commerce guy. He's worked in many of our communities doing economic development plans. And so a few years ago, the funding that he was getting through Crown Indigenous Relations back then was Indian Affairs and Northern Affairs Canada, or something of that sort. Their names changed a few times, but so he had to be creative because they combined the economic and lands funding together. And so he partnered with friends of his and opened up Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. So we have been open since 2014. Again, as mentioned, all of our staff is Indigenous. So there's 15 of us, I think 16 of us. I'm pretty sure today we just hired somebody new. So it's great because we are growing. One of the things though, with our organization, we are continuing and will continue to hire only Indigenous peoples. And so we've got a little bit of backlash around that in terms of we're being discriminated now. But one of the things that we look at is that we're trying to bring back that balance, right? We are a for-profit Indigenous organization, hiring our own people to work with and in our own communities with those perspectives. And we will continue to do so until that balance is brought back to place. With that, again, you know, some people think it is discrimination because when you're in a place of privilege, you don't often see what others are going through. And so as we continue to build our organization, being a for-profit, not a not-for-profit, a for-profit, you know, where we're going to continue to fight that battle around us being discriminative. And I hope you take that back to your friends and colleagues that it's not being discriminative. We need to support more of our organization or more of our Indigenous folks to be able to open up for-profit organizations who are hiring our people to do the work that you in this room, a lot of you in this room are hoping to partner with folks like ours to do the work that needs to be done moving forward. So again, our vision is to make a positive difference in the communities we serve by the positive application of both Western science and traditional knowledge. And so, these are a multitude of services that we offer within CIPS, both from the Western and the traditional knowledge perspectives. And so we really understand and recognize that that is a need moving forward in the world that we live in and the work that we have to do in order to sustain that and what sustains us, which is Mother Earth. So about me, as mentioned by Tim, I am a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. I've worked in my community for many years. And so I'm going to back up just a little bit because it's something that we're taught. And I have to, I'm going to be completely honest here. I am learning. I am, 45 years old, and I'm learning about who I am as an Indigenous woman and what my responsibilities, roles, traditions, and teachings are, which many of us are that are doing this work in this room and within the world, actually. So, Anin Bojo, Minogijup, Kerry-Ann Charles IAGLR, Ashunyan Dunjaba, Mayingan Dodam, Anishnabe Kwe and Dow, Bindigan. So I've introduced myself in the language. We're told that we are to do that so that the creator knows who's speaking and how they can support us and the things that we are doing. So as mentioned, I am from Chippewas of Georgina Island. I worked in my community for many years, wearing many different hats. I've even served a term on council. I don't know if politics is something that I'll get back into ever again, but it was definitely a privilege and something that I was grateful for in my community to allow me to gain that perspective. Because for me in the work that I do, it's so very important to have perspective, right? That's why it's so important to have these disciplinary teams and to be able to engage from all levels, because without perspective, how can you make decisions for people when you don't have their perspectives? And how can we be inclusive if we're not making those opportunities to engage and get those perspectives? So I started this work in an environment in around 2011, and I started to be brought to some of these tables where I was Kerry-Ann Charles from Chippewas, Georgina Island First Nation, high school diploma. I did have honors, very, very intimidating. So I went back to school and got a business diploma, but that's as far as I've left it. So I got that business diploma in 2011. So I stand up here not as an academic from a university or doing an undergrad or doing anything like that. I stand up here as a community member that's very passionate about my community, very passionate about the environment, and very connected from my Indigenous roots to that environment. And so that's what sort of drives me, motivates me, and that is why I'm here today. So as mentioned as well, I have two great kids. My youngest actually just turned 19 on the 28th, and my oldest will be 24 in August. It just baffles me that I'm an empty nester. I'm not quite sure what to do with myself, but and I started in Cambium in 2017. When I first started in Cambium, it was called Cambium Aboriginal. We since changed our name to Cambium Indigenous Professional Services to be more politically correct, right? The government keeps changing our name about and how we should be identifying, but I still have elders that tell me that they're Indian, right? So again, really being inclusive and engaging to ensure that we're gaining perspective from those people. So in our culture, it's important to include background and context so there can be understanding. This is one of the reasons why I'm told that, oh, sorry, I'm using two different clickers here. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm told that storytelling is so important. So I want to take a moment to give you a background so you can understand how I got to speaking in front of you today. Now knowing that I am not an academic and I'm not doing a research program or anything like that. So I also want to let you know the uncomfortableness it is to be in a room like this when you're not an academic. And so please bear with me. I am very nervous at this point, and I've done this for quite some time. As Tim had mentioned, I've been asked to speak all over the place, but every time I speak, I feel like it's the first time. And it's something that I actually hold really very near and dear, because I feel that that's the creator keeping me humble And the moment that I lose that feeling, the moment I know that there's something wrong, right? It's ego then that kicks in. And that's something that our elders have told us is one of the biggest things that colonization has brought to our people and to this land is ego. So I just wanted to share that. And I wanted to thank Ruth because just before this, she actually came up and gave me a tobacco tie, which has really given me the strength to look in this room at all of these faces that Sapna had told me you couldn't see because you couldn't see them yesterday. So again, I started this project in 2011 through funding through Crown Indigenous Affairs and Northern Affairs Canada. I was the Environment Partnership Coordinator at that time the Environment Coordinator at that time in my community. Funding started to flow through Crown Indigenous Relations. And so my band manager came into my office, put the request for a proposal on my desk and said, can you write a proposal to this? And I looked at it and went, climate change? I guess so, right? So I did. And so at that time, as well, our community is very progressive in terms of doing environmental initiatives. And so at that time, I had also just been appointed to sit on the Lake Simcoe Coordinating Committee, which was the public committee that was put together to help in the recommendations to the minister around how that act was being implemented, being that, you know, Lake Simcoe is I think the only lake in Ontario that has an actual act that protects it and preserves it. And so at that time, I was able to get to know some folks. One of those folks being Al Douglas from the Ontario Centre for Climate for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, also known as OKR, which has now changed their name again. They are now called the Climate Risk Institute. And so had some great support from him and his team in order to put this project together. And that is the project that was mentioned in terms of the Georgina Island First Nation Adaptation Planning Framework. And so I'm gonna give you a little bit of information around that, but also recognizing that, and I think this has been said over and over again over the last couple of days, the sensitivity of the natural world, the changes in the weather and climate affect the ecosystems and the socioeconomic aspects of every community, but particularly the Indigenous communities. And so want to make sure that that's in your head. And as I go through this presentation as well, and sort of, I want to walk you through what that adaptation planning framework looks like. I want you to recognize that this framework, when we put it together, it was one of the things that I wanted to do when we first started working on this project was I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just for my community. I wanted to make sure that as we were doing this work, that this work could be extended out to other communities to help them take that overwhelming feeling of how do we approach this stuff in our communities. And so that's really what we did is we built a framework that can be adapted, not just to our communities, but also for the non-Indigenous communities. So also those communities around the globe, so it can be adapted. And we had that in mind when we did that. So I took advantage of that big, beautiful map that was laid out on the floor. I think it's awesome. It's actually something that I've wanted to do in one of the projects in terms of this community engagement. And it was a colleague of mine that had mentioned it. Her name's Stephanie Allen. Some of you folks in the room might know her. She's pretty awesome. But it's called Map Me Happy. And it's about developing a big map like this and just allowing people to walk on the map and point out those places that are special to them. And so as you can see here, I've circled in the red, that's Lake Simcoe. So that is a Shunyong, that's what we call it. That's what it's known to us as, is a Shunyong, and which means the shining waters. And then in that, you can see I've circled, and that's Georgina Island First Nation. And so that's my community where this work first took place. And it's crazy that we started this over a decade ago. And so that's where we are. So I'm going to walk through this framework. One of the things that got me into the environment field, and I love it that I do have a story, is when I did serve a term on council, I did run for a second term. Our terms at that time were only 2-year terms. And so you can imagine you can't really get too much done in that 2-year term. And I did run again because I did have some momentum in getting things done, although the political world sort of traumatized me a little bit. But you know, you gotta trot through sometimes. But at that same time, in terms of when I was running for that second term, the rules had changed, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indian Act and later on, but the rules had changed in regards to who could run in community. And at the time, before that, if you were off reserve community member, you couldn't run for council. And so the second term that I ran, they changed that rule that you could run for council if you were off reserve member. And I actually got voted out by one vote, which actually led me down the road that I'm down today. And I'm really grateful for that, because we are told that, you know, our paths, we don't choose our paths here when we come onto this earth, that our paths are actually chosen for us. What happens is often we're not in tuned enough to our surroundings to be able to grab a hold of what that path is and run with it. And so instead of looking at that one vote and then not getting into council as, you know, something as negative in my life, it's actually probably one of the most positive things that ever happened to me. So I'm going to walk you through this framework that we've developed. So you can see here, there's 7 steps to it, and we're going to walk through quickly. We're not going to walk through the whole thing, but we will walk through quickly these steps, because I think it's very important. And I truly believe that this sort of framework will and could create that transformational change that Linda talked about on day 1. So the first step was actually really getting started. So really trying to identify why we are undertaking adaptation planning. And this reason could be different for everybody. The reason that we did this project is because there was a proposal that came across my desk. I had the partners to be able to help write it. We got the funding, and so we actually implemented the project into our community. We wanted to define the project scope. Again, for this project, it was very broad. We just wanted to go into our community and really do a few things. One, help them understand what climate change was. And I'm going to talk about a language a little bit later on. But for most of our community members, they didn't really know what climate change was. And so we had to ensure that they had an understanding of what that meant so that we could build ourselves up for success for the project. And without doing that, we wouldn't have been as successful as we are. We wanted to develop that communication plan. So we really worked with our partners, and we worked with the admin to really try to figure out how we were going to communicate this project to everybody. So the outside organizations, as well as the community members, as well as chief and council, and anybody else that needed to know what was going on. And then one of the biggest things that we did, and the most important thing that we did, was we had established an advisory committee. And so that was building the Georgina Island team. And one of the other steps that we did is we actually took some time and we hired what we called a community climate change adaptation liaison. And so that liaison was actually someone from within the community that was living in the community at the time. So she's not, our community liaison in our community was not a community member, but she is affiliated to our community, and she's Indigenous. She's actually from Constance Lake First Nation, and just so happens, she happens to be my sister-in-law. So at the time, my brother just started dating her. She moved to the island, and you know, we put up the posting, and you know, she was the one that applied and took that position, which I think was really, really awesome at the time, because of the fact that she didn't have those inter-community relationships that often get in the way in some of the work that we do, that most people don't really recognize or understand if you don't live in community. And so we hired her. We also created an advisory committee. There was 10 community members that that group consisted of. And one of the things that we did again with that, trying to do things differently, was we actually made a call out for letters from our community members, asking them asking them to submit whether or not they wanted to be sitting as a part of that committee, and why they would be, what they would be bringing to that committee. We got 10 letters, and so we kept everybody. But we also ensured that there was youth, adults, and elders, as well as sort of a representation from each of the families within the community. Again, really to help that, to alleviate those tensions that can sometimes be caused in community through this work. The advisory task, the advisory committee helped us customize the traditional ecological knowledge survey. They said, and which I'll talk about a little bit, suggested a list of potential interviewees, produced guidance, advice, and feedback throughout the project, and served as advocates for the community and promoted active involvement of the community members. They also helped enhance community awareness regarding the impacts of climate change. So again, really being able to have that community support, that community involvement in this stuff was key. So community engagement, again, a big part of this, right? Without that community engagement, we would never have been successful in the project that we did. And even with the projects that are moving forward. And so one of the things that we really recognize is that you need to meet people where they're at, right? And so we're an island community. One of the things that we have a ferry boat that has a schedule. There's not a whole lot to do in our community. So one of the things that we did that everybody likes to do in our community is we held bingo sessions. We had really great prizes to get the community members out. Absolutely, whatever works, right? And in a lot of our communities, a lot of the times what we'll do is we'll hold feasts, and we did that as well throughout. But one of the biggest draws and one of the biggest things that folks really loved about this project was that we had that fun piece involved there with that, right? And so what we did, we actually would host bingo games with a bunch of good prizes, but in between each of those sessions, we would actually give information around the project. And during the times that we had bingos, we'd also have different ways of being able to have people give us back information. So we would have boards up around the room that had information on them, that had sticky notes that people could write things on. We had maps up that for people to do the same. We had the surveys ready there for people to take home if they wanted to. We had sign up sheets for people to sign up to be able to do these interviews at their leisure with our climate change liaison. So again, very important in terms of getting the community involved. So step 2 of this process was, and we hear a lot about that. You guys are the researchers, right? So that data gathering, right? And so working with our partners at the Climate Risk Institute, we got the historical climate data. We looked at the future climate projections. But the key thing here that is often missing in the work that the researchers do is that traditional ecological knowledge, right? And so we actually took 1 full year in our community to go around to our community members and ensure that it was inclusive to gather that traditional ecological knowledge from our communities, our community. So again, there's that historical data, and this is the importance of partners, right? So a lot of our communities and a lot of urban communities or rural communities don't have the knowledge or the expertise. And I try to stay away from that word expertise. Again, it's just something that doesn't mesh well with our Indigenous perspectives, where expertise sort of puts you higher above everybody else, where, you know, in our culture, we're all equals. And so specialists, I think is a better word. So, you know, very important to have those partners, and the Climate Risk Institute was that partner that helped us with gathering that historical climate data as well as those future projections. So the traditional ecological knowledge, here it says presents a rich fabric of knowledge and wisdom that relates directly to environmental stewardship, preservation, and the enhancement of biological diversity by the First Peoples of Turtle Island. And so there's many variations of this definition, such as this one, but the one thing that's often missed in when people talk about traditional ecological knowledge is the fact that it's place-based. So that's so very important when you're doing your research, when you're talking and wanting to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, is that you recognize that it's place-based. So the information that comes from my community, it might have some similarities in some of the other communities. Oops. Sapna. But it's place-based. So, you know, you have to recognize that as you're moving forward, that it's not cookie cutter, right? You can't take traditional ecological knowledge from one community and think that it's going to work in another community. So one of the things that we did with this project was we developed what we call the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Survey. And so this work actually comes from work that Laurentian University, Dr. David Pearson has been doing over several decades. And we used that work that he did to help us in developing our survey. And so the survey that we developed, we gathered information from the elders, the youth, the counselors, the chief of the community, staff, and others that the advisory committee had pointed out would have pertinent knowledge. And so in that, these are the sort of topics that we had worked through with our advisory committee in terms of what were important to our community in order to be able to figure out what those vulnerabilities are, what's going on with climate change, and what are those changes that people are seeing. So again, changes in the bush, changes in wet areas, fish, changes in the birds, animals, insects, the changes in the weather, winter weather, effects on climate change of the community infrastructure, and weather emergencies and health. So those were sort of the main topics that we had figured out was important to this work in our community. Step 3 then was being able to assess current vulnerability. So using the information that we gathered in step 2, we brought all of that information together and we developed what we called impact trees to be able to visualize, and I'll show you one in a minute. But then we were able to then prioritize with those impacts with the advisory committee. So this is what our impact trees look like. And this is very, very important because this was, I think, something that, again, really helped in the success of our project, was that one, people were able to visualize what those effects were that come out of the community and how they were connected to each other. But it also helped the project team be able to make those connections very easy as well. The other really important thing about this was that throughout all of this work, and even in the adaptation plan, we used verbatim. We didn't take what our community members had said and then translate it into the Western scientific colonial way of writing things down so that the document looks the Western colonial way. So what we actually did, again, is we used verbatim, and we found using verbatim, people then can actually see themselves in the work. Especially with Indigenous peoples, we often get asked for our knowledge, and then when we see that final product, we don't see ourselves in that anywhere, right? And I can say that that's probably true for most communities, right? Regular community members. You don't see yourself in it. And so very important for people to be able to see themselves in this stuff, because they're the ones that are going to actually have to implement, going to have to take accountability for those adaptation plans. This was a diagram that was developed by one of the communities that we got to work with after we had developed this project. And again, just another way to be able to visualize things that can connect people with what they're doing and what they're saying and what they're actually going to be tasked with doing. And so this one is just the medicine wheel, where it's actually broken up by season so that you can see and put those changes in by season. Then we prioritize those risks. And so this, Sapna's presentation yesterday really hit home to me, because this stuff is real. The pictures that you see here in this prioritization slide come from my community. We see this ice deterioration. We see the health and safety risks. We see the ecological disturbances that are being caused because of the ice not forming the way that it used to because of climate change. And one of our biggest is transportation. Again, we're an island community. We're only an hour outside of the GTA, but we are considered a remote community. And in the wintertime, we use an ice road. This is the second year since 2017 that our lake didn't freeze and our ferry boat has run all year. So, very, very real and very close to where we are today in terms of communities feeling those impacts. So again, you can see this, we prioritize these based and those are verbatim. No roads, struggle to get around, ice pileup, right? Those are coming from our community members. So step 4, prioritize future risks. So we needed to research future weather and climate conditions. Those were those projections that our partners helped us with. Determine how current vulnerabilities will be impacted by future climate. Create likelihood and consequence ranking scales and worksheets, and fill in the worksheets with the project team. Again, pictures from my community. This ice condition, this unsafe conditions caused by climate change are very, very real. And so what we did was we, again, took all that information, we did future projections and determined how current vulnerabilities will be impacted by future climate and developed what we called risk scenarios. And so you can see at the bottom here, one of the risk scenarios is extreme precipitation in the wintertime. Poor ice conditions, which leads to vehicles going through the ice. And, you know, more times than not, that leads to death. And I am witness to that in terms of, I can count, I can't even count on my hands the amount of people that I know that have gone through the ice and lost their lives. So again, very, very real. We took that then and we estimated the likelihood. And so again, all of this stuff you can sort of tailor to whatever community, if it's an Indigenous community, a non-Indigenous community, an urban, rural, tailor all of this stuff. And so what we did was then we took all of the climate risk scenarios that we had put together and we put them through a likelihood. So what was the likelihood that this would occur? We also did that exercise for consequences. What are the consequences of this stuff? And so we used 4 different sort of categories, which were the social, economic, environmental, and cultural. And also you can see the subheadings within that as well. Again, all of this stuff can be changed up based on the community that you're working with and what their priorities and needs are. And it was talked about yesterday, same thing. What we did was we put them in a risk matrix to figure out where they sit and what should be looked at first within our community. Again, going back, and I'm going to drill this into your head, and I think it has been, which is awesome for me to hear around the community engagement piece, right? Far often than not, and still, you know, that it's not there yet, is that we're making decisions not based on our own perceived perspectives and lived experiences without going out to the public and gaining those different perspectives and being able to have a different perspective then as we move forward in this work, making sure that as we do this work that we're being inclusive. And so what we did, we stepped aside from the bingo session, but we did get really good prizes again, which drew people out. But this time what we did is actually we did sort of like a speed dating kind of game where we workshopped, where we took the 5 climate hazards of changes in winter, changes in summer, extreme precipitation, wind and drought. And we had each table, each vulnerability facilitated by one of the team members in terms of having discussions with the community members and really validating what we were bringing forward in this work. And so what we did is we came back with all of those risks that we had developed. We asked the community members for their validation of that. But what we also did with the community members was ask them about consequences. And so and whether or not those consequences and what we're doing and have done to adapt to this point would be sufficient moving forward to the future with those climate projections. And so again, what we ended up with that was with a prioritized risk, right? So this came from the community. Again, all of this stuff, right from the grassroots, right from the bottom up, came from the community, was not changed whatsoever. They can see themselves in this stuff. And so you can see here in the red, those are the most prioritized risks that came out of those sessions. And they sort of worked their way down in terms of least prioritized. But when you look back at those impact trees, you can also then start to look at some of those adaptation actions and how things are connected with each other. And so that is step number 5, identifying adaptation actions. So what we did was start with the highest priority risk and develop a list of adaptation actions for that. We looked for those win-wins, no regrets. So again, really looking at those impact trees that served an awesome purpose when we were developing those. We had no idea how much information those pictures would move forward. And so really being able to see where those things are connected, right? So if you start at the top and you can on those branches, if you can start to cover, you can see that it would cover a whole lot of things that were brought up. And so then evaluate the adaptation actions. So adaptation actions. So again, I'm not going to go through this. We define them by enhancing adaptive capacity, engaging people, and improving knowledge and reducing threats. So those are the things that we looked at when we developed our adaptation plan. This was our adaptation plan. We actually ended up developing 67 adaptation measures for our community for climate change. And it's a range of things. And those actually can be dug down into, which we actually did moving forward with things like health, things like flooding. So this was an overarching sort of project. Again, so the implementing those adaptation actions. So we developed a implementation plan for all of those actions. And that implementation plan identified the who, what, where, how, and when. And this is a project that I wanted to bring forward in terms of that implementation. So this is the project that, this is why I got to go to Egypt and speak at COP27. We got together a group of multidisciplinary folks, including folks back at the table there for the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority. And we developed, we took one of the adaptation measures, which was there's a creek in our community that was both identified through the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Survey that was culturally community significant, but also was creating flooding within our community. And so we took that project and we implemented it based on the plans that were developed through our adaptation planning project. Again, a big component in here was the community involvement, but a big piece that was also included to me to this day is the biggest reason why the success for that restoration was so quick was we included our ceremony. We included a cultural component to that restoration. And so this is sort of some before and afters. Again, we had our school kids involved. We had all of our community involved in this process from start to finish. Some more before and afters. And this is the one that I love the best. So this was, we put up a trails cam and we called it Gertie's cam, and could identify and watch that creek come back to life. And believe it or not, we did this restoration work in fall of 2017. This was in the spring of 2018. This is how quickly that ecosystem bounced back with the process that we used. Again, importance of community engagement. I just want to drill that into your head. Again, they need to be informed. They need that clarification and validation. They need that grassroots approach. And we found that with that built in the accountability to them to be able to move this work forward. So it was a complete grassroots up. So that document was then taken to our chief and council, and it wasn't necessarily needed to be approved, but that was the approach that we took. It wasn't the council pushing it downwards. So step 7 is monitoring. So a lot of the time this gets missed in a lot of our projects. This wasn't part of our original project, but we did get creative. And so again, with our partners at the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, we actually used our school kids to be our monitors. And so that place became sort of an outdoor classroom for them. And we were recognized by that, by the Conservation Authority. So again, very important in regards to partners. These were some of the community partners that we've been able to work with in doing this process. Some of them are still continuing on. So Beausoleil, I'm still working with Beausoleil First Nation. They actually have implemented a community-based climate monitoring program now, which we've actually developed curriculum around that is being implemented into their elementary school so that this stuff is actually going to be ingrained in their community moving forward. There's other projects too, but I don't have time. These are other partners. So again, you know, that Gertie's Creek project was a huge success because of those outside partners. We don't have the knowledge. We don't have those specialists in our community to be able to sort through that data, all of that stuff. So again, very important to have those partners. We did policy review, looking at some of our policies in terms of that climate change lens as well, looking for those barriers and those drivers to climate change and identifying those for moving forward. We also did hazard mapping, which actually was awesome because we were able to, again, use the technology and allow folks to actually come and speak with us during interviews. And we had live maps that they could see and actually pinpoint where special areas were, where medicines were, all of that kind of stuff. But one of the biggest things that came out of this hazard mapping piece is that we were doing our roads at the same time. And the engineers actually had done their schematics or whatever you want to call it, and where the culverts were being placed were actually completely different from what we had come up with the traditional ecological knowledge, and then being able to put a layer of that over the layer of the engineer's work. And so where we were actually able to from that change the diameters and the placings of the culverts while we did our roads. So very, very important. We would have had to do it again. So just a couple of more examples. Again, we did sub-watershed planning with the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority. Again, they're back there. But this was actually when we did our sub-watershed plan, it was the first plan that they actually incorporated climate change into. And so it was a real honor for us and being able to do our sub-watershed plan too, because we got the knowledge from them on how to do that, but what we were able to do with that, and do it all again differently, but it is a start. We were able to really incorporate it into our sub-watershed plan, that traditional ecological knowledge, that cultural traditional aspect, which you don't see. Again, trying to indigenize and decolonize this stuff. Challenges, lots of challenges, and I think, you know, these are all challenges that we all face in terms of this stuff. But there are lots of successes as well that, you know, I'm not going to read off because I still have some stuff here that I want to go over, and I see I'm getting low on time here. So this is the stuff that I think folks are really wanting to hear, but I think, again, it's important for that background, right? I'm not an academic. I'm standing up here in a very important space in terms of research and being able to do what we need to do to adapt to climate change in the Great Lakes region. And so these are some of the key concepts fundamental to adapting to climate change from my perspective. There's relationship that I'm going to talk about, Creator's Law, TEK, impacts of colonization, two-eyed seeing, ethical space, 7 generations, and contrasts and values. And I'm sure and I know there's lots more, but these are the ones I'm going to talk about. So for many, land means property. This is relationship. For many, land means property, the water, air, and all that live within these ecosystems. For Indigenous peoples, land means more than property. It encompasses traditions, culture, relationships, social systems, spirituality, ecosystems, responsibility, and law. Communities have permanence and an understanding of the land that they call home, that is place-based. They have an intimate relationship with the land and the waters, which could include burial sites of their ancestors, spiritual places where certain ceremony or gatherings take place, certain species that have been cultivated for particular purposes, the animals in which hold significance and valuable teachings, roles that stem from the natural elements, such as a woman's role for protecting the water and the man's role as being a firekeeper, along with the laws in which bind and guide those relationships. I just wanted to, again, talking about the Great Lakes, again, our relationship with water. So I'm not sure that most of you I'm not sure if most of you know about grandmother Josephine Madobin, who actually did the Great Lakes Walk, right? But you know, there's lots of us out there fighting for that protection and preservation of water, because water is life. Whether it be leading those water walks or standing up to protect pipelines from going under riverbeds, the Indigenous peoples all over the world have been there and have the voice for the voiceless, as we have a spiritual connection, relationship, and responsibility to protect and preserve that which sustains us all. In the words of the Anishnabe Nation, water is the most life-sustaining gift on Mother Earth and is the interconnection among all living beings. Water sustains us, flows between us, within us, and replenishes us. Water is the blood of Mother Earth, and as such, cleanses not only herself, but all living things. Water comes in many forms, and all are needed for the health of Mother Earth and for our health. The sacred water element teaches us that we can have great strength to transform even the tallest mountain while being soft, pliable, and flexible. Water gives us the spiritual teachings that we too flow into the great ocean at the end of our life journey. Water shapes the land and gives us great gifts of the rivers, lakes, ice, and oceans. Water is the home of many things that contribute to the health and well-being of everything not in the water. So all life requires water, and yet our global water supplies are quickly being dried up and polluted. The First Nations people of North America have a special relationship with water, built on our sustenance ways of life that extends back thousands of years. Our traditional activities depend on water for transportation, for drinking, cleaning, purification, and provides habitat for the plants and animals we gather as medicines and foods. Our ability to access good water shapes these traditional activities and our relationships with our surroundings. As Indigenous peoples, First Nations recognize the sacredness of our water, the interconnectedness of all life, and the importance of protecting our water from pollution, drought, and waste. Water is the giver of life, and without clean water, all life will perish. First Nations are seeking the recognition of their authorities over the water and require resources to build capacity, to advocate for our water's rights, and to protect the health of the water that Mother Earth gives. Many First Nations seek to restore the traditional ways of protecting the health of the water and to share these ways with the world. And I think that's something that you folks in this room can really help to do. It was mentioned yesterday by Sapna around the boiled water advisories. Again, something that's still very real. It baffles me. We can put a man on the moon, but we can't give people clean drinking water. But I just wanted to throw that slide in there because it's very real. My community is still on a boiled water advisory. We did get money to get a new treatment plant, but these are the things that people don't know if you're not in community. Sure, we have a great new state-of-the-art water treatment plant, but we have no one to fill those spaces to be able to run that because we're not given the funding needed to then support to keep those people in community. We can't compete. We can't compete with the financial aspects in all of this. And so we need your help and support in that as well. And those sort of things need to be brought to the attention, right? When we talk about climate change and we talk about the inequalities and the marginalization of people, we have to keep those in mind. That and bringing those equalities back to people is a piece of climate change. So Creator's Law, all things are regarded as beings, plants, trees, animals, insects, rocks, and the unseen forces of nature are all considered beings. Indigenous people regard for life is one that recognizes the value of all life, of all beings. We are all related to one another as we all have the same mother. Thus, we all are responsible for maintaining good and harmonious relationships for our next 7 generations. So Indigenous peoples followed these laws for millennia. and outcomes and effects for abundant, thriving biological diversity. We are of the understanding that humans are part of and must remain in balance with the ecosystems. There's a real personal connection to those beings that do not have voices and who are ones that sustain us. Therefore, our responsibility to the land and water differs from non-Indigenous peoples. From this place of connection, knowing and understanding, we have the knowledge around how interconnections can and will have ripple effects. It's relationships, if relationships are not considered. This way of thinking is why the inclusion of First Nations personal values are so important to take into consideration while carrying out projects such as adapting to the changing climate. There needs to be a great deal of effort put forth to ensure that we are reaching out to and connecting with community members for planning and implementing projects. So with that as well, right? Again, a lot of the research, again, it's based on science, right? And so one of the things that I really want you to think about and take home in a different perspective is that in science, we're told to leave our personal out, leave it at the door. Don't have your emotions. You don't want to be biased. It's quite the opposite from the Indigenous folks, right? We're given those emotions for a reason. If we're not in tune with those emotions, we're making bad decisions. And this is what's led us to where we are today. So as researchers in this colonial structure, I want you to recognize that, right? I say this and it's probably not politically correct, but it's think about everything that we're doing now. And if we want to create that transformational change, we need to do the opposite from the Indigenous perspective. And I'm gonna show you a chart here that really shows that shortly. So I talked a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge already. I think the piece here that I want to bring forward is that, again, Western science differs from TEK because there is a time-limited observation process. Science usually requires a quantitative validation and is often believed and considered valid once written down into textbooks, whereas oral tradition is knowledge that is embedded within Indigenous ways of knowing. So there's a big difference here between science, Indigenous science and Western science that needs to be brought forward. And you know, that I think that picture says it all, right? Our traditions is based off our animals. That's that connection. So impacts of colonization. So Indigenous creation stories indicate that each nation was given instructions as to their role and responsibility to Mother Earth. These instructions are perceived as sacred gifts and are obtained through visions and dreams, as well as from teachers. By teachers, I'm not referring to your professors or mentors, but I'm referring to the environment and all who reside within it, such as the winged ones, the four-legged, the swimmers, and everything else in between. The land communicates as a teacher and is a repository of knowledge and wisdom. The laws of the land are guided by the spirit world, and the law of its use is sacred to the Indigenous people. The knowledge and wisdom gleaned from the land is felt as opposed to abstractly learned, and people whose knowledge is felt knowledge or sensory knowledge will often look at the world very differently than those whose knowledge is primarily intellectual. This is, in some ways, is also referred to as traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge systems, among others. In Canada, in 1876, Parliament passed the Indian Act, which established the reserve system and gave the government control of almost every aspect of Indigenous people's lives. It aims to force Indigenous people to assimilate into settler society, or also termed as get rid of the Indian problem. This included taking away our rights to practice our traditional cultural beliefs, in which we were jailed if caught practicing, or if we were in possession of culturally significant items. Amongst many other injustices, such as the stealing of our land, the sterilization of our women, the abduction of our children, residential schools, and the 60 scoop, to name a few. Due to colonization, and still prevalent today, this responsibility has been a difficult one to uphold and has led us down the path of environmental destruction that we travel today. I think that is very important for folks in this room to recognize, right? And it's not often, I don't think, in these sort of forums that depth of, I think, emotion is brought into the room, and it's something that we need to do moving forward. Two-eyed seeing. This is, again, Ruth did a very good job in explaining this, so I'm not going to explain it anymore. One of the things that I will point out about myself in terms of two-eyed seeing, one of the things I didn't mention when I introduced myself is that my dad is from Georgina Island First Nation, and just found out actually that maybe Ruth and I are related at some point down the line, because my dad's mom is actually from Nawash First Nation, but because of colonization, that is a side of the family that I don't know, but that is on my bucket list to be able to track those folks down and get to know that side of my family. But on my mom's side of the family, I'm actually, my grandparents are both from Newfoundland. So I always say that I've actually really got the best of both worlds. I've termed myself growing up a Newfie Indian, right? Again, you can see where those over the terms and those politically correct but that is still something that, you know, to this day I will call myself as a Newfie Indian, because that's my perspective. That's what I grew up with. And a lot of my elders will still call themselves Indian, as I mentioned before, because that's their perspective. That's what they know. Don't tell me who I am. Right. And so, yeah, so that two-eyed seeing piece, really taking both worlds, the best of both worlds moving forward is so very important. In the Indigenous culture, it's not about best. Again, a word that we shouldn't use. We don't call them best practices. We call them wise practices, right? Really trying to get away from those hierarchical, you know, imbalance language. Another term that's been used widely is ethical space. And so really being able to, especially in a room like this with the researchers, really being able to understand that an ethical space brings balance, right? You don't come into a room, and this is something that happens to us quite often. And you know, it's probably going to take a long time before that balance is received or retrieved or whatever word you want to call it. But that Western colonial is always the one that encompasses everything else, right? And so in moving this stuff forward, we really have to have that two-eyed seeing approach and being able to create these ethical spaces where each knowledge system, each perspective, each individual lived experience is at the same level, so that we come to that understanding and we can move forward in that good way. 7 generations. So I attended I spoke at a conference a few years ago. So it's actually, I think it was 2019. It was just before the pandemic, and Henry Lickers was there actually. And so, you know, I often was asked, what does 7 generations mean? And I wasn't able to really articulate it until I seen Henry's presentation. And this is what he had presented in terms of what that looks like, right? Where people can actually really, again, visualize where they stand in terms of that 7 generations and how long we should be thinking and planning, not these 4-year terms of government, right? Not these 1-year observations and making decisions, but we need to be thinking that 7 generational thinking. And so again, you know, you can see yourself in the middle, and quite often you're able to meet your great-grandmother, people, your grandmother and your mother, right? And then as you have your child and you have your grandchild, and you're lucky enough to be able to have your great-grandchild, right? So it was a real great visual for me to be able to help people then understand what that 7 generation thinking looks like. So thank you, Henry. 7 grandfather teachings. And so this is something that we live by. I'm not going to go through them all, but a big one for me, and you know, it's my clan. I come from the Wolf clan, is humility in rooms like this. You know, really being able to step back and recognize that you don't know everything, and you shouldn't. We're only one people, right? And so that in that colonial construct, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. You know, we're often told or encouraged to be the best, and that sort of mindset needs to go. But if we live by these 7 simple principles, right? Again, the more I learn about our culture and the simplicity that has so much complexity in it is awesome. And I'm going to talk about that too. So this is one of my favorite visuals. And this book was actually gifted to me by one of my elders. And actually I met a couple of folks from Tyndonega yesterday and asked me if I knew Shelley. And I do. So Shelley Charles is a elder of mine from my community, and I attended an event of hers, and she gifted me with this book. And I've read it several times, and I take a lot of knowledge out of it. But this is one of the things that really jumped out at me, and is that contrast of values between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And it's something that we really need to understand about each other as we move this work forward. Because if we don't have these understandings about perspective, we're going to butt heads, and we don't have time to butt heads. We need to collectively come together with that understanding in those ethical spaces, using two-eyed seeing to be able to adapt to our changing climate collectively for the betterment of all beings. Some other key concepts that I want to quickly go over here. I just added this picture in because I didn't have a picture, and this was actually comes out of the work that we did for Gertie's Creek. We actually created materials, one of them being a coloring book, which sort of describes, and it was written by my sister, actually, who is very ingrained in bringing back the language, and my cousin Heather, who is an artist and very traditional. And so all of the illustrations were done by her. The story was written by my sister, and I got to publish it. So I'm a published coloring book person, I guess. But this has been used as a tool in being able to create those relationships with our off-reserve members. So it's a tool that's used in our schools and various projects that I don't have time to get into. But I do want to talk about some of these other key concepts. So language, hierarchy, approach, fear, complication, competition, Western laws and boundaries, and history. And I'm going to go through them quickly. So language, there's a lot of misconceptions around language, and we talked about this, and I heard this actually in earlier presentations around different words. So tribal versus reserve, or First Nations, or reserve versus reservations, right? Reservations is used a lot in the States, where reserves are used here in Canada. There's also things like climate change itself, right? I'd mentioned when we did our project, a lot of the people in our community didn't even know what climate change was. Heck, I didn't even know what climate change was until that proposal came across my desk. So really understanding that language is we need to look at language and make sure that we're speaking the right language. Another thing is the preconceived notions. So the work that we're doing now, and this came from a teacher in my community when I was working in my community around a program that we got to work on together called the On the Land program. So the Mother Earth Mentoring Program, which is a day every Thursday is dedicated to our kids to be out on the land, learning the tradition, learning the culture, and then that comes back into the classroom, and the teachers actually connect that with the curriculum and not the other way around. And so when we first started doing this program, we weren't getting the community engagement that we wanted to get. And so the second year, we started talking about it, and she's like, I'm not going to term it the On the Land program this year. I'm actually going to term it the In the Land program. And I looked at her, and she's like, because we already have these preconceived notions about what things are when we use certain words. And so when we say on the land, the community members are like, oh, I know what that is. I don't want to be involved or whatever. But when we say in the land, people are like, what is that? I want to find out. Right. And so if we can start to make these, little tweaks on words, we can start to help people think about things differently. And I think that, again, is one of those things that are going to give us that transformational change. Oops. I didn't want to do that. I don't know how to go back. Oh, there we go. So a hierarchy approach. Again, really needing to take that grassroots, not top-down approach. It's a parental approach. I say parental approach because when you look at our histories, that's what it's termed as, right? So when we got colonized, British actually sort of looked at us as the children, right? So when we're doing this stuff, especially in communities, that could be a trigger or a trauma, right? So that top-down approach, we need to be able to really take it from the grassroots. And from that grassroots approach, again, right, you can see that builds that accountability into people themselves, especially when they can see themselves in the work that you're doing, And again, the top-down approach, it's really dictatorship. I deal with this a lot with programming and trying to get funding, right? You write a proposal, but then you find out that there's already these sort of parameters around what people are looking for. And so it's not really work outside the box. It's we'll let you think outside the box, but if it doesn't fit our box, then, you know, you don't get the funding to move forward with it. Fear. This is a big one. And again, you know, I stood up here saying that it's traumatizing, really, being in a room of folks that have been put through that colonial system of education, which is the system that really traumatized our people, right? But it's also a system that can get us out of the messes that we're in. And I talked a little bit about that in terms of some of the work that we're doing with some of the communities and developing curriculum that has both the two-eyed seeing that is being implemented into those schools. But again, fear of questioning authority, right? It's ingrained in us and we're taught, don't question authority, right? That's just something that's ingrained in society. And again, we've been fearful of thinking different. Universities are the best for that, I think, in terms of that. And I know they're changing, and then I don't want to, you know, we need both worlds, but, you know, I put it like this. You're an organization that gets applications, but then you weed out those applications for those people that fit in those boxes that you're looking for, right? So really you're just coordinating people that think like you to do work like you, right? And that's not diversity to me. So again, thinking differently, right? Complication, and there was another thing on the slide that I missed back there was the governance structure and government, and going back to our governance structure where it's not hierarchy, but looking at those Indigenous governance structures and how we work in circles and how we hold each other accountable without that fear. Complication, administrative burdens. Again, actually, it was funny. Yesterday, I went for a bit of a walk. I ended up Nathan Phillips Square, and there's another big Indigenous research conference going on in the U of T that I didn't know about. And so I actually met a fella from Saskatchewan that told me about this, and we had some conversation, and we were talking about funding and stuff like that. And we were talking about the red tape. And he's like, no, it's not red tape. It's white tape. I was like, that's awesome. I'm so going to use that. So there's that, right? The complication, the complex and unrelatable. So we talked about that. I think somebody talked about that earlier in terms of, you know, these publications that come out or these things that we want the public to do that unless you are somebody working in that field or research or have that language or understanding, most people don't know what it is that they're supposed to do because it's complicated, right? Things are so complicated when they come from the government down or from a researcher's perspective, because there's all this terminology that is unknown to the general public, folks like myself. That's why you have people. I often say, I know a little bit about a lot, but I know a lot of people that know a lot about a little bit. And that's where there's you folks come into play. Again, competition, race to be the best. We got to cut that out. Right? It's something that's ingrained in us. Again, get that good education, get that good car, get that big house. That's your happy life. Not true, right? We need to get rid of that sort of economic consumer perspective in this stuff. Monetary value to knowledge, one of our biggest demises, right? I think from my perspective anyways, right? We're told in our culture that knowledge is responsibility. And knowledge you're supposed to share, and you're supposed to share freely and willingly. When you come into these kind of circles, it's about that copyright, right? And again, this comes from a friend of mine. I'm doing a project with York Region School Board, and you know he's Indigenous, and one of the things he said is that we have to stop striving for copyright and start striving for respect. And again, that need to be a scholar. This is one of the reasons why I'm getting over this fear of standing up here right now, because I am not a scholar. And I want to make sure that those Indigenous youth, those Indigenous folks within our communities, and those folks that may not be Indigenous, that, you know, aren't people that are school people, can recognize that by doing and being passionate, you can be in these spaces too. Western laws and boundaries. There's lots of outdated laws. We heard about permitting, one of them, right? those things need to shift. They are actually detrimental to those relationships that are so important that have been talked about over these last few weeks or last few days. I had someone ask me once from Edmonton about how to, I want to build a relationship with our community, but we actually have policies within our municipality still that prevent that from happening. And those are still there. It's like the Indian Act, right? It's still, we need to look at those, we need to get rid of them, and we need to sort of break down these barriers. And again, thinking differently. I'm almost done here, folks. Communicating with Indigenous peoples. So it is imperative that we are included in these conversations. Communicating with Indigenous peoples is no longer just something that should be done. It is something that must be done under legislation, such as duty to consult and accommodate, and more recently, the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This, although in my opinion, should not be the reason that you want to engage and include Indigenous communities and peoples. You should want to reach out and build what I call respectful reciprocal relationships for the sake of our collective future. And in doing so, here are some of the things to keep in mind. Trust, this was brought up yesterday by Sapna as well, is the foundation of meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples and with all peoples. Really, again, I go back to the beginning of this presentation where it was done in community, but it's transferable to everybody, right? So research is necessary to have an understanding of community that you want to engage. Respect is vital to ensure the trust will be earned. Recognize the rights of Indigenous people and its representation in legislation. Remember, colonialism has an impact and it will take time for those impacts to be rectified. One of the things that I want to point out here is that we're not the only ones that have been colonized. You guys have been colonized as well, right? This stuff goes back to that history. And if it wasn't, if we weren't colonized upon contact, we wouldn't be having these conversations right now. Responsibility. It's on you to ensure that you educate, that you're educated so that you can appropriately and adequately ensure the work being undertaken is inclusive of the Indigenous perspectives and knowledge, creating the best plans possible for our future generations. And I'm not going to read all of this stuff on this next slide. You can read it, but I believe that continued meaningful inclusion of Indigenous voices and perspectives at forums such as this, as well as at the government tables where policy is being developed and decisions about the environment are being made, is imperative. Indigenous people hold wealth. Indigenous peoples hold a wealth of knowledge that will be beneficial to all nations in the face of a changing climate. And I am hopeful that if we all start thinking of human rights as being the rights of all beings, as expressed under the Creator's law, strive to live by the seven grandfather teachings, and make our decisions based on the principles of the 7 generations, that the impacts of climate change won't be so devastating, and Minnow-Maudslin, which is a good life in Anishnabe is achievable. And I will leave you with this to think about as well as you do your research and have an understanding that this is our understanding, right? We don't own the land or anything either. It's theirs, and we have to recognize that. So with that, I say Chimigwaj.
Kerry-Ann, just an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of microphones circulating if people have questions, but I also appreciate that some people have flights and travel to get to. There's lunches, we have other sessions occurring. So my apologies for putting a little rush on, but please, Kerry-Ann is going to be with us at least for the remainder of the day. Do try to find her. But again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.